She was the granddaughter of Rome's first emperor. Born into opulence, draped in the finest silks, and surrounded by tutors, slaves, and senators, Julia the Younger's life seemed destined for grandeur. But the gilded halls of her youth hid a dark truth. At just 14 years old, she was forced into a marriage she did not choose, a union with her own uncle. What was intended to secure political alliances instead became a chain that would bind her to a lifetime of humiliation and heartbreak. This is the story of Julia the Younger, a girl born into power, trapped in a web of political ambition, betrayed by her husband, disgraced by her family, and condemned to die in exile. Chapter 1. A Child of Empire. Julia the Younger was born around 19 BC, into a world few could even imagine. The Julian family was the epicenter of Roman power, and as the granddaughter of Augustus, she entered life already burdened with immense expectation. Her grandfather had forged Rome from chaos, turning a republic riddled with civil wars into a powerful empire under his control. Every senator, soldier, and citizen looked to him with a mixture of awe and fear, and his family was both revered and scrutinized. Julia's earliest years were spent in palaces that seemed to float above the city itself, structures of gleaming marble with floors so smooth they reflected the flickering torches at night. Gardens stretched endlessly, filled with fragrant flowers, carefully sculpted fountains, and statues of gods and emperors watching silently from their pedestals. Servants and slaves moved like shadows, anticipating every need before it was voiced, and tutors arrived daily to teach lessons in literature, history, and the complex rituals of Roman etiquette. Yet, for all the beauty and luxury surrounding her, Julia's childhood was far from a carefree one. Every action was observed and measured. The slightest misstep could later be remembered and twisted into scandal. Even at the age of 5 or 6, she learned the subtle language of court politics, how a nod, a glance, or a smile could signal loyalty, intelligence, or a dangerous lack of judgment. In her world, even children were actors on a stage where the audience was always watching. She was surrounded by examples of both power and fragility. Her parents, Augustus's daughter Julia the Elder and her husband Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, were themselves carefully molded pieces in Augustus's political puzzle. Their successes and failures were public, their marriages scrutinized by senators, soldiers, and the citizens of Rome alike. Julia learned early that family could be both protector and weapon, that blood could shield but also betray. Education for Julia was rigorous and relentless. Tutors recited the verses of Virgil and Ovid, teaching her not only to memorize poetry, but to understand allegory, rhetoric, and the art of persuasion, essential tools for anyone navigating the treacherous waters of imperial Rome. Lessons were conducted in Latin, sometimes Greek, and occasionally in the careful whispers of philosophy. She learned the stories of Rome's founding, the battles of her ancestors, and the grandeur of gods and heroes. Each story was a lesson in ambition, loyalty, and the price of failure. But alongside the intellectual education was a harsher, unspoken curriculum, preparation for life as a pawn in her family's political game. Julia observed her older relatives carefully, noting the subtle power struggles, the silent exchanges of favors, and the quiet punishments meted out to those who displeased Augustus. She was young, yet she already grasped the precariousness of her position. To be born into the imperial family was to be safe in wealth, but exposed in reputation. It was to carry a crown of expectation without the freedom to remove it. Play, laughter, and childish rebellion were luxuries Julia could scarcely afford. when other girls in Rome played with dolls or chased each other through sunlit courtyards, Julia's attention was drawn to lessons, etiquette, and observation. Yet she was not entirely devoid of childhood wonder. She sometimes wandered the gardens alone, her small feet brushing dew-soaked grass, watching the fountains shimmer in the morning light, listening to the distant sound of the Tiber flowing. In those moments, she glimpsed a life that might have been hers, simple, playful, and free. Even friendships were complicated. Other children of Rome's elite could be companions, but they were also competitors. Alliances were as vital among children as among adults, and Julia had to learn which friends would support her, which would betray her, and which were merely instruments in the games of power. Every interaction was an exercise in strategy, every laugh a potential calculation. By the age of 10, Julia understood something most girls her age could not. Her life was not her own. Every day brought a lesson in control, in restraint, and in the subtle art of surviving under the shadow of an emperor. Her future, her marriage, her social position, her very identity, would be dictated not by love, curiosity, or personal desire, but by political necessity. When Julia turned 14, that future arrived abruptly in the form of a marriage she did not choose, a marriage that would mark the beginning of her fall from the glittering heights of Rome's courts to the isolating cliffs of exile. Yet at this moment she was still a girl, lingering on the edge of childhood, caught between innocence and the unrelenting demands of empire. The life that awaited her would be shaped not by the choices of a young girl, but by the ambitions, fears, and calculations of her family. In the world of Rome's elite, childhood was fleeting, freedom was non-existent, and the cost of being born a Julian was higher than any other fortune could ever match. Julia the younger had learned this truth early, though the lessons had only just begun. Chapter 2. A Marriage of Convenience. When Julia the younger turned 14, the brief illusion of childhood ended. The marble halls that had once been her playground now became her prison, and the soft whispers of her tutors gave way to stern voices plotting her future. In Rome, a girl of her lineage was never her own master. She was the empire's, a vessel for alliances, heirs, and political security. It was then that Augustus, her grandfather and emperor, decreed her marriage. The chosen groom was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, her maternal uncle by marriage. He was not a stranger, but neither was he a man of affection in her life. He was a figure of politics, a piece in Augustus's web of power, and Julia, still a child, was the thread meant to bind him. This was no love story. There were no courtyards filled with stolen glances, no letters exchanged in secret, no blush of affection that blossoms between youth. This was a contract, signed not with ink, but with bloodlines and duty. For Augustus, the union tightened his grip on Rome's elite, tying Julia's fate to a man whose loyalty he sought to secure. For Julia, it was a surrender of her voice, her choice, her very self. Imagine her on the day of the wedding, the veil covering her face, heavy and suffocating, the streets alive with celebration, though not for her happiness, but for the stability of the empire. Senators toasted the union, praising Augustus's wisdom. The people watched in awe, marveling at the spectacle of imperial grandeur. Yet beneath the silk and jewels, Julia was trembling. She was still a girl, her hands soft, her laughter childlike, and now she was being led into the home of a man who was, by Roman law, both her husband and her elder. In Rome, marriages such as these were common. Women of noble birth were pawns, their bodies exchanged to seal alliances, their wombs expected to produce heirs that strengthened the ruling class. But for Julia, the cruelty was sharper, for she knew her marriage was not meant to nurture love or companionship. She was being passed like a prized possession from one hand of the Julian family to another. Her new household was a world of cold grandeur, marble pillars, ancestral busts, and the sharp echo of footsteps across polished stone greeted her each morning. Servants bowed to her, but she could sense the whispers that followed her back, the curiosity, the judgment, the subtle reminders that she was here not for herself, but for what she represented. In Paulus, her husband Julia found no comfort. He was older, ambitious, and deeply aware of the political advantage her bloodline brought him. To him, she was less a partner and more a symbol, the emperor's granddaughter, a living bond tying him directly to Augustus's power. Their conversations were measured, their interactions formal, their marriage more a performance for Rome's benefit than a union of two souls. And yet, Julia had no recourse. Divorce was not hers to demand, and disobedience was unthinkable. She had been raised to obey, to smile when required, to play her part in the endless theater of empire. But inside, she must have felt the quiet ache of loss, not only of childhood, but of the possibility of a future built on her own desires. Still, Julia did what she had been taught. She adapted. She learned to move gracefully within her new household, to endure the cold stares, to bear the weight of expectation without faltering. Her role was clear. She was to be the dutiful wife, the silent partner, the vessel of loyalty between her husband and her grandfather. But beneath the silence, Rome itself was shifting. Ambition never slept within the walls of the empire, and even in the security of her marriage, Julia would soon find herself caught in storms far darker than she could imagine. The marriage that had been designed to protect her would instead lead her into betrayal, disgrace, and tragedy. For Julia the younger, marriage at 14 was not the beginning of love. It was the beginning of her undoing. Chapter 3. Betrayal and Treason. The marriage that had been designed to protect Julia quickly soured into something darker. She had been forced into her role as wife at just 14, expected to carry herself with grace and obedience, to be the quiet bridge binding her husband, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, to the Emperor Augustus. But within the marble walls of their household, cracks began to form. Paulus was not a man content with loyalty. He was ambitious, restless, and dangerous. To him, marriage to Julia was not enough. He had tasted proximity to the emperor's power, and he wanted more. In the shadows of Rome's corridors, whispers began to spread. Secret meetings, quiet alliances, rumors of a conspiracy so bold it could shake the foundations of Augustus's empire. Some claimed Paulus sought to place himself at the head of a plot against the emperor. Others whispered he planned to seize power outright. For Julia, barely more than a child, these rumors were not simply stories carried by slaves and senators. They were daggers pointed directly at her life. In Rome, a woman was bound to her husband's fate. His sins became her stain. His treason became her disgrace. Imagine her nights during this time. Lying awake in a grand but lonely chamber, listening to the footsteps echoing through the villa, wondering if her husband's whispers with his allies would one day bring soldiers to her door. Did she know the full extent of his plans? Or did she, like the rest of Rome, learn only through fragments? Servants' glances, hushed words that fell silent when she entered. Treason in Rome was no ordinary crime. It was the ultimate betrayal, an act that carried not only the penalty of death, but the erasure of honor, property, and name. And when Augustus learned of Paulus's betrayal, he acted with ruthless efficiency. The sentence was swift and merciless. Paulus was executed. The man to whom Julia had been bound in marriage, the man who had once stood beside her as her protector and partner, was now branded a traitor and cast into oblivion. But Augustus's judgment did not fall only on Paulus. It fell on Julia as well. Though she had committed no treason herself, though she was guilty only of being his wife, her reputation was now poisoned. To the eyes of Rome she was tainted by association. The granddaughter of the emperor was now the widow of a traitor. Julia was still a teenager. Her face, still carrying the softness of youth, now bore the weight of disgrace. She had entered her marriage as a child, uncertain but dutiful. She left it as a widow, shrouded in shame. In the bustling streets of Rome, people whispered her name with pity, with scandal, with curiosity. Some blamed her for failing to control her husband. Others pitied her, trapped in a fate she could not escape. But in the rigid world of imperial politics, pity was no shield. Behind the closed doors of the palace, Augustus's disappointment in her was said to be palpable. He had entrusted her to a man who betrayed him, and, by extension, she too had failed him. Whether fair or not, the judgment was the same. Julia, the younger, was now a marked woman, her life overshadowed by treason not her own. It was the beginning of a downward spiral from which she would never recover. Her marriage, meant to secure her place, had instead destroyed it. Her husband's betrayal had condemned her, and though Paulus was gone, the weight of his treason still pressed down on her shoulders. And in Rome, once scandal attached itself to a name, it was nearly impossible to wash away. For Julia, the execution of Paulus was not just the death of a husband, it was the death of her innocence, her reputation, and the fragile hope that her life might one day belong to her. Chapter 4. Scandal and Exile. The execution of her husband should have been the end of Julia's suffering. She was a widow still in her teens, her name already stained by treason not her own. But Rome was not merciful. In Augustus's empire, once suspicion attached itself to you, it clung like a curse. Soon, new whispers began to coil through the city, whispers that would seal Julia's fate. The granddaughter of Augustus, it was said, had dishonored herself. Adultery, infidelity, the most damning crime for a Roman noblewoman, and unthinkable for one of the emperor's blood. Whether these accusations were true or invented hardly mattered. In Rome, reputation was everything, and the mere suggestion of scandal could destroy a life. For Augustus, image was his empire's foundation. He had spent decades crafting a vision of Rome as a city reborn under his moral guidance. He passed laws exalting family, chastity, and loyalty. His own kin were expected to embody these values. And so, when rumors of Julia's supposed indiscretions reached him, Augustus responded not as a grandfather, but as an emperor. The punishment was swift. Julia, the younger, was banished. No longer would she walk the colonnades of marble palaces, where senators gathered in hushed conversations, and courtiers bowed at her passing. No longer would she dine in rooms lit by golden lamps, surrounded by laughter and music. Her world of wealth and influence collapsed overnight. Instead, she was sent to a barren island, far from the pulse of Rome. Where once she had been surrounded by courtiers, she was now watched only by guards. Where once she had known silk sheets and perfumed baths, she now endured rough stone walls and the endless howl of sea winds. Exile in Rome was not merely isolation, it was erasure. Letters were forbidden. Visitors were restricted. She was cut off from her mother, her siblings, and any remnants of affection. To the empire, Julia no longer existed. She was a ghost while still alive, and yet, in this bleakness, the cruelty was sharpened further by memory. Each morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Julia would have remembered the gardens of her youth, the fountains that once sparkled with light, the laughter of companions, the warmth of belonging. Each night, as the waves battered the shore, she would have thought of the banquets, the music, the endless promise of a future that had been stolen. For a girl raised to believe she was Rome's jewel, exile was a living death. She had been born with every advantage, wealth, beauty, lineage. But those advantages had become chains. Her family's name, which once shielded her, now ensured her suffering. Augustus could not allow his empire's moral image to be stained, and so Julia became a sacrifice, not for a crime proven, but for the protection of appearances. In the streets of Rome, her name became a warning. Parents whispered her story to their daughters as caution. Beauty and power are fragile, and the wrath of empire spares no one. Among senators, her disgrace became another tale in the endless gossip of politics. To Augustus, her exile was a necessity. To Julia, it was a sentence worse than death. She was young, still in the bloom of her years, yet condemned to isolation, cut off from everything that gave her life meaning. Julia the Younger, once Rome's bright promise, now became Rome's forgotten shadow. And though she still breathed in the eyes of the empire, she was already gone. Chapter 5. Death in Silence. The sea was the last sound Julia the Younger ever knew. Her exile stretched not for months, but for years. What had begun as punishment became a kind of slow erasure, a life lived in the margins of empire. Forgotten by Rome, abandoned by family, she lingered on the edge of the world. A woman who had once been celebrated, now reduced to a name barely spoken aloud. No couriers came bearing news. No letters carried the warmth of her mother's hand. Even her children, if she had ever hoped for them to bring comfort, were raised far away under the empire's watchful eye. Julia's exile was not simply meant to remove her body from Rome. It was designed to erase her spirit, to ensure she lived and died unseen. As the years passed, the world she once knew moved on. Augustus grew older, Rome shifted under new ambitions, and fresh scandals replaced her own. In the city where she had been born, her name was no longer a warning whispered at banquets. It was a silence, a forgotten echo. And on her lonely island, Julia faded. She was still young when death finally came. Though the exact year is uncertain, the truth is clear. There was no marble tomb raised in her honor, no procession of senators, no speeches to immortalize her virtues. Her end was quiet, stripped of ceremony, as though Rome itself wished to deny she had ever mattered. In the empire's eyes, Julia the Younger had died long before her body failed her. But in truth, she had lived a life that revealed the cost of power, a child raised to be an ornament of Rome, sacrificed when she no longer fit its designs. No triumph, no gold, no crown, only the sea's endless whisper and the silence of exile. Closing reflection. Julia the Younger's life is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of an empire that demanded perfection and destroyed its own when they fell short. She was born into privilege, yet had no freedom. She was given wealth, yet denied happiness. She was promised honor, yet left only with shame. Every stage of her life was written not by her, but by the hands of men who saw her as a tool, a daughter to bind alliances, a wife to secure power, a scapegoat to protect Rome's image. Her fate shows the cruelty of Augustus's Rome. the empire that claimed to value family, loyalty, and virtue, but sacrificed its daughters to protect its reputation. Julia was not exiled because she was dangerous. She was exiled because she was inconvenient. And that is the most haunting truth of her story. History remembers Augustus as Rome's first and greatest emperor. His name is carved in marble. His monuments still stand. But his granddaughter's grave is unknown, her memory erased, her life reduced to a cautionary tale. Julia the Younger reminds us of the human cost of empire, the forgotten voices, the silenced women, the lives traded for power. She was married to her uncle at 14, widowed by treason, condemned by scandal, and abandoned in exile. She never ruled, she never commanded armies, she never sat upon a throne. Yet her tragedy tells us as much about Rome as the triumphs of its emperors. And so, in the end, Julia's crown was not of laurel or gold. It was of silence, exile, and sorrow. A crown that gleamed not in triumph, but in tragedy.